Most teams treat work like GPS in our car. We set the destination, we follow some steps, and boom, we arrive. But what do you do when GPS drives you off a bridge that isn't finished? Well, today we're talking with Jen Briselli about complex systems, why best practices often backfire, and why learning, that real living-in-the-moment learning, is the engine that keeps teams from sinking into the lake. What's up, UX fam? How's your mom and them? Welcome to another episode of Beyond UX Design. I'm Jeremy. If you're new here, welcome. I am super stoked to have you. You ever ship a feature that should have never seen the light of day? Or survive a sprint planning where nothing got planned? Or maybe you just said, let's circle back under your breath for the 50th time this week? Well, you, my friend, have earned a Merit-ish badge. Introducing the Beyond UX Design Merit Badges, a vintage-inspired sticker series for UX designers, PMs, and engineers who have seen things. Choose from 3 sets: soft skills, sharp tongue, Cult of Figma initiation, or the Pixel Pusher survival kit, and more to come soon, so stay tuned. Each set of 5 badges celebrates the chaos, the coping, and the conference calls that should have been DMs. Stick them on your laptop and flaunt them at your stand-up. Show the world that you made it out of Q2 with your sanity mostly intact. Get 1 set of 5 stickers for $12 or 2 sets for $20 at beyonduxdesign.com/badges. Just promise me one thing. Send pics and show me where you stick them. How often do you stare at a blank Figma canvas unsure where to start? Well, this episode is brought to you by Mobbin, the ultimate UI and UX design inspiration library. Mobbin gives you instant access to over 400,000 beautifully designed UI and user flows from apps that you love, and content is added weekly, so you never have to start from scratch again. Quickly find exactly what you need, search by app category, UI patterns, or even specific features. My team and I use Mobbin daily at work to find useful patterns, and it helps my team work much more efficiently. And honestly, I can't imagine kicking off a new feature without Mobbin. So you're ready to level up your design process? Visit mobbin.com/beyondux to get 20% off Mobbin Pro and never run out of inspiration again. If you haven't done it already, please consider subscribing to the show wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you are regular here and you feel like you're getting something out of the show, I would really appreciate you leaving a 5-star review. That would help me out so much more than you can imagine. And as always, thanks so much to Chris, Siraquan, Stacy, Radu, Megan, Andrew, John, Mark, Kevin, Jason, Michelle, Marty, Tino, Adina, and Zoe for all their support. And if you want to join these fine folks and many others and help keep the show independent and ad-free, you'll get exclusive access to the entire video library of episodes, including episodes before they're even released. Get instant access to those videos right now for as little as $5 a month. And for more information on how you can support the show and help more people find out about what we're doing, make sure to check out beyonduxdesign.com/support. And of course, if you think the shows worth sharing, then I would love it if you told some friends. So we often treat product design, product development, sort of like I'm putting on Google Maps. I type in a location, I follow the steps, A to B, and out comes great software. But what normally happens, especially in large matrixed orgs, if you've ever worked at enterprise or even at a startup, let's face it, it's not simple either. There's complexity, there's systems, there's people that don't do the things that we expect them to do, and we end up with a giant mess. So today I'm so excited to have Jen Briselli on the show. Jen is a strategist, designer, researcher, and educator who helps teams realize the transformative potential of risky play, complexity-informed design, strategy, and transdisciplinary collaboration, driven by a deep curiosity to understand the hidden patterns across disparate domains and the desire to empower other humans with these insights. Jen partners with brave folks who work at similar intersections that want to provoke, create, or occasionally subvert. And previously as Chief Design Strategy Officer at MadPow, and now as co-founder of Topology, a systems-oriented experience strategy firm, she helps orgs co-create the services, experiences, and the conditions that enable people to live well on their own terms. Jen, welcome to Beyond UX Design. I am so excited to have you on today to talk about complexity. It is often not easy to do our jobs, and I'm excited to dig into that with you today.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Jen, you have done a lot in the complexity science space, and I have never heard that term before you and I talked not long ago. So I know I read your bio there a little bit, but tell us a little bit about you. Tell us how'd you get into complexity science, and ultimately how'd you come to understand that it's not as simple as reading a recipe to deliver great software?
Yeah. And it's funny to hear you say I've done a lot. I haven't done a lot in complexity science. I've just learned a lot about it.
Learned
and
a lot.
I use it in my practice now. I want folks to know right off the bat, I'm a learner too.
I know.
But yeah, so for those who are listening to this who have no clue what this is even all about, I mean, the short version is complexity science is the field of study that looks very trans, or I would say even at this point, like post-disciplinary, kind of across many, many, many different fields and disciplines with the lens of understanding the behavior of systems. So there are certain types of systems that you would consider to be complex, and that is in contrast with other types of systems like merely complicated or simple and predictable. Da, 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 da. But at the end of the day, the behavior of complex adaptive systems is something that we as a species have really started to look at seriously only since the 1980s, really, the contestable date. But as a field, complexity science is still relatively nascent. So I got into this field or got interested in learning about it actually as far back as when I was an undergrad. I actually studied physics, majored in physics, loved learning all the typical things that designers would put on their resumes today. I'm a problem solver, fall in love with the problem, lifelong learner. Da, da, da. And for me as a young kid, that was the most fundamental thing was, well, I want to study everything. Where do I start? Physics is the most fundamental thing, right? So I studied physics. I realized when I was in school, I didn't want to go to grad school. I didn't want to climb higher inside like one disciplinary silo. I wouldn't have used that language at the time, but I know that's what was at work. And I would have enjoyed it for sure, but I really wanted to be able to kind of touch a lot of things. And I had been doing some peer tutoring and I really enjoyed the challenge of understanding people's mental model and figuring out how they make sense of physics and other things. And I was like, huh, that's teaching, isn't it? So I took my physics degree and I went off and became a high school teacher. And I taught high school physics for a little under a decade. I loved it at first. I'm just glossing over such long and storied kind of narratives here to say it was really awesome. But after a few years, I sort of fell out of love with teaching because it really felt like I was kind of solving the same problem every year. In designer speak, it was like being handed the same design challenge every year and told to solve it a different way every year, which on one hand could be super fulfilling and interesting, but on another, it starts to feel like you're repeating. It's the movie Groundhog Day, you know? So I was craving new challenges and new things, and I just serendipitously found out about the world of experience design. And I was like, what is that? I'm designing learning experiences. You mean I could design other kind of learning experiences? So went off back to grad school to study service design, experience strategy, some systems thinking, all that stuff in the mix, and moved into the world of UX. But to tie that back to why complexity science, well, as a physics major, one of my favorite topics was chaos theory, a lot of the stuff that has to do with when systems behave in unpredictable ways, the nonlinear dynamic stuff. And then fast forward several years to realize when I was doing my master's in design that a lot of those same ideas were factoring in when you start thinking about systems thinking. When you're designing something, whether it's a product or a service or a touch point, being able to zoom out a little bit, both in space and in time chronologically, to think about factors that are a couple orders larger than where you're at, or to think about factors that are a little further down the road, second and third order effects or consequences of things you're doing. I just always found that really interesting and compelling. So that led me to the rabbit hole that is complexity science. Happy to share resources and things with the listeners. But now in my work, which is largely, I would call some kind of mix of design, strategy, consulting. I don't know what I even call myself most days. Complexity science is a discipline I draw on heavily in my practice, even if I don't use those words with my clients or with my collaborators. So that was my entry. And I think a lot of people I know have similarly winding paths. It's a lot like people's entry into UX. People used to come to UX from so many angles, library science, architecture. Nobody just woke up and decided to major in UX 20 years ago. Might be doing that now more, but I think complexity is similar. So I suspect some of you listening or watching, this might be your first exposure to it and you're like, ooh, that sounds intriguing. Awesome. Come on in, jump in. And for those who already know little bits about it, you're probably hearing something not unlike your own. So that was my onboarding or my origin story.
I love it. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's interesting because this idea, we talked about this a little bit before and you were surprised when I said this, but I just stumbled upon this topic actually completely by accident. The concept of VUCA, for instance, and volatility, uncertainty, and complexity, ambiguity, and all those things. And you have a really great talk from Rosenfeld that you gave, and you mentioned in the talk, you just sort of casually said, we hear people throw this term around all the time. And I was like, I've actually never heard anyone else talk about VUCA, but
saying that, maybe that's a little bit like condescending.
No, it's fine. I mean, it's interesting because I just wonder, like, who am I hanging out with that no one's talking about this? But it was sort of by accident too, which got me really excited about this. I actually worked for GE at the time, and they had this leadership training that they would do, and we had the entire course for the week was all about VUCA, and we got to play this like really fun like role-playing game where we ran a company, and you've probably seen this thing before. I'm sure like it was a spaceship company. We had to make rockets or whatever. Anyway, but the whole idea was throwing around things that are volatile, constantly changing, uncertainty where you don't know what's going on, the idea of complexity and moving systems and all this stuff. And one of the things that I was thinking, I'm like, oh my God, this is just like building software. This is figuring out like one, how to navigate the people that you work with, but also like beyond that, all of the things that happen that impact the experience. And I came up with this idea. I call it the UX uncertainty principle, where, if you're familiar with the Heisenberg uncertainty principle as a physicist, I assume you
Yeah.
are,
May or
you
may not
can't
have a
really,
tattoo of that actual.
oh, no way. Right
Yeah.
on. Well, this is interesting. I want to talk about this because I love this concept. But the idea is Heisenberg, for anyone listening to this, obviously, but, and tell me if I'm wrong, by the way.
Nope, not sure.
But we focus on trying to measure the speed of a particle. We can't measure the mass of the particle. And so if we try to measure the mass, we have a hard time measuring the velocity or the speed. And I think it's very similar with UX design, where we tend as designers a lot of times will focus on the pixels and looking at the buttons and figuring out the topography and the border radius and whatever. But when we focus like on that, we're not focusing our attention on the other things that actually impact experience, like that are completely often outside of our control. Things like the environment that the user's in, or their mental model, or their past experiences, and all those things that could make or break that experience, even if you've just spent all that time focusing on the most amazing UI design, right? So anyway, I call it the UX uncertainty principle. But this idea, though, of thinking about that and figuring out how we can go and learn those other things to improve the overall experience. And I feel like as designers, we have this hubris that we control the user's experience. Like we can dictate what the experience will be if we just focus on these things. So anyway, I'm really excited to get into this today. So as designers, I feel like I hear this a lot. We throw around complexity. You see it on job descriptions, thriving complexity and all that stuff. And I think a lot of people often, they conflate complex and complicated, but those are not the same thing. And you do a good job, I think, of stressing this. I'm curious though, what is the difference from your perspective of complex and complicated, and why should designers care about that?
And I should preface all of this with, if you walk down the street and talk to 10 people who know complexity science in any way, like they're not all going to agree on this. There isn't like a universal complex means this, complicated means this. In much the same way that like UX means this, experience means this, UI, UX, product, like interaction. So in the same way that design terminology and the semantic concepts behind them are slippery, just know that this is how it is within the world of complexity as well. The community of people that finds themselves in this world bring such different perspectives. So that said, I do find there is one framework in particular. It's called the Cynefin framework. We can link all this later. But that is the framework that's from Dave Snowden, and it's decades old at this point. But it's the one that differentiates these terms. There's actually 4. It's usually shown, technically there's 5 domains. But we're not going to get into that right now. But basically thinking about complex versus complicated. And then it also talks about chaotic versus really simple. But we can come back to that. The distinction between complex and complicated to me seems like one of the most meaningful for designers, because of what you just alluded to. And the thing that I would say that most people should understand, if nothing else, is that complicated systems, though complicated, are still ordered in a sense that there is some predictability. There is still a linear cause and effect, meaning if A, then B, probably. And usually what makes that hard to deal with in a complicated system, as opposed to, say, a very clear and simple system, is just that it's like there's a lot going on. There might be, so much stuff that like no one person can kind of get their arms around it. And so you rely on experts in some form. And you may even have experts who see differently, but through some level of analysis, you can get to a place where you can kind of get your arms around this thing and understand some level of causal relationship between things in the system. I'll give an example of that in a second. But to contrast that with complex, in this framework and in this way of talking, the word complex, rather than the way we use it kind of colloquially, oh, that's really complex, really specifically means a system where that causal relationship really isn't there anymore. So in other words, in a complex system, which usually has certain characteristics like emergence or self-organization, where the components of the system, which can be non-human things as well as humans, have a level of agency and self-control such that you can no longer really predict, even if you have a really good sense of the system, just because there are so many pieces that act with some level of agency, freedom, and the level of the interconnectedness between the parts gives rise to these behaviors that are no longer something you can say, like with a causal link, this happens and then this happened. When people start to do that to complex systems, they're applying kind of an after the fact, like I'm applying this rational sort of this happened, then this happened, but that only gets applied like post hoc, and that's not necessarily even accurate to do. So when we talk about that, like why do we care about the difference? Because it actually allows us to approach questions or decisions in complicated domains differently than in complex domains and know that will be more effective. So, fast examples. And I don't remember where this came from originally. It gets passed around a lot. I wish I could figure out who should get like original credit, but I often hear people use the example of a simple system, a very simple ordered system is baking a cake. It's a recipe. As long as you use the right ingredients and actually follow the recipe, you're going to do the same thing each time. You will get the same results each time. In that case, you have best practices that you can follow because it worked here. In this case, it will work here tomorrow. It'll work in this other case in a week because everything is the same and predictable. Complicated is a little bit up from that as far as how much stuff is going on, but it's still ordered and predictable. So that's like building a rocket. You mentioned rockets earlier. Good example. Building a rocket is a lot harder than baking a cake. It probably requires more people, more expertise, more perspectives. There's a lot more to figure out. But at the end of the day, you still got the laws of physics on your side. There is some level of prediction and control that you can exert. You may not have perfectly best practices that you can always rely on, but you'll have good practices. So as long as you can compile the right expertise or the right perspectives or do enough research or analysis, you'll get there. Complex, on the other hand, is more like navigating human relationships. If you have kids or you have taken care of pets or you've managed yourself in a friendship or a romantic relationship, it's those scenarios where someone says, there's no instruction manual for that. And you think about it, it's not like it's that wildly different. It's still parts and in things interacting with each other. The laws of physics are still true, but the human component or the unpredictability, the fact that we all have free will, the fact that so many things are interdependent, and this other idea becomes really important, which is context. Things might be different in different contexts. So that is more the example between navigating a family dynamic and building a rocket. They're both hard, but one is merely complicated in this language, this definition. The other is complex. And lastly, there's a fourth in this framework, which again, I'm oversimplifying, but they use the word chaotic. They don't mean chaos theory like math, but chaotic as in just something's on fire. So no time for like thinking and analyzing. It's act decisively and kind of get the situation into a place you can move forward. With complex, I should say briefly too, I mentioned you've got best practices that work in simple, ordered, predictable scenarios, and those do still exist in the world. Baking a cake, like I said. Complicated, like building a rocket, you have good practices. You wouldn't call them best because there's still some different ways to approach the same challenge. In complex systems, you can't rely on best practices because what worked today or in this context might not work for you in a future state because the system will have morphed by that time or because the context is different. And so the interdependent dynamics are going to be different. So that context dependence makes a big difference. And we would say that complex systems or domains call for emergent practices. You have to kind of sense and respond and learn your way forward. Hence my interest in learning and how it intersects with this stuff. So I'll stop there, but that's the fast like primer on this stuff, which I mentioned is from a framework that isn't mine. It's one that's kind of used and bandied about quite all over the place these days. But I think it's really effective for designers because you can start asking, is the thing I'm trying to solve right now simple? Could I just look up the best practice for accessibility standards or placement of a button? Is it complicated? Like setting up all the rules for permissions if I'm designing like a really complex, like permissions kind of interaction where I'm going to have different roles and you might need to do a little bit of research. You might need to do a lot of analysis or kind of figuring out. It's just a complicated jigsaw puzzle, but it is doable. Versus complex might be thinking about how do I actually join these very disparate pieces of software into a cohesive journey that's going to involve some crazy interdependencies that are going to have humans in the mix. So as a designer, you can start asking yourself, when am I dealing with a complicated situation or problem versus complex. And I might approach the two differently. And right now, I think most designers are drawing almost entirely from our toolkit that really work well in ordered, predictable situations. And there's a whole world of complex stuff out there. And complexity science and a lot of the systems kind of oriented methods out there help give us some tools for working on this side of the fence.
Yeah, I love this. So here's something I was thinking about as you were talking. I didn't actually graduate. I dropped out early, but I was going to school for economics. And one of the things that always fascinated me about economics was just the one of the Keynesian's invisible hand, where humans will always act rationally, and if this thing happens, then they will do this. And I've always thought that was interesting, because what's rational for me is not rational for you, and how I will behave in a certain situation is not how you will behave in a certain situation. And it's interesting because as you're giving these things names, I'm starting to think about economics. We always said that this thing will happen, humans will act rationally. That, to me, it's like a very complex system, right? A human is not always going to do the same thing. But what's interesting about that is we tend to lean on, as designers, heuristics, where humans will tend to do a certain thing. And I'm just curious, like you mentioned best practices and things like that. And the question I'm kind of going here is, if we don't have best practices, what do we lean on? I'm thinking something like heuristics, where humans don't always act the same, but they tend to, as a whole, on average, perhaps. And this is where economics comes in. On average, humans will tend to do this. If you raise interest rates, they will tend to not buy as much or whatever. So if best practices don't work in complex systems, what do we tend to lean on? Is heuristics and averages or things like that the wrong way to approach it? Or does that just have us making assumptions and then setting us up for failure?
It's a yes and a no. I mean, basically, it's if I can't rely on best practices, what the hell am I supposed to do? You mean I have to learn fresh every time? Like, my bosses and my executives and our boards and our shareholders are definitely not going to approve us like learning everything from scratch every time we do something. Yes, the age-old question. Well, to your point, and for those who are interested, there are some definite deep dives you can even do into what complexity and related kind of fields of study actually, where they intersect with economics, because the rational actor model is kind of one of those places that the same was true for me as I learned a lot about economics. And when I was younger, I was like, I just can't with this, because it doesn't seem to have space for the fact that humans aren't going to always act rationally according to what that model would say. And then you get stuck in the loop of trying to say, well, humans are irrational. But as I'm sure people have maybe seen, there's been a lot of good work over the years in more recent neuroscience and cognitive science that it isn't even a question of being rational, because sometimes when somebody does something that you might look at and say they're being irrational, in fact, they are working off of the best that they have, the information that they have, the experience and tools that they've developed, whatever's been modeled for them. And also they're weighing, and not always consciously, in fact, usually not, they're weighing the pros and cons. I don't want to get off on a tangent, but like this comes up a lot when you think about attitudes and ideologies and you say, why are those people voting or behaving in ways that go against their self-interest? It's because in their perspective and where they're situated, it's not against their self-interest. They might see that there is more safety in maintaining some level of choice or behavior that is aligned with a worldview or a social in-group who affords them more protection, even if the thing they're doing isn't supported by logic or rationality or science or whatever. So we won't go down that rabbit hole, but think about applying that now to your point about design. If I'm designing experiences, how am I supposed to do this if I can't rely on always put this thing here on the screen? First of all, you can still. There are definitely things that are still generally true. And the question of heuristics is a good one, because there are definitely places, and I do thinking about heuristics rather than cognitive biases, because most of what people call cognitive biases, it has this like tone to it that's like, we're all idiots. And so we use these wrong rules. And in fact, they're shortcuts that our brains have created because our brains have to make decisions with limited glucose resources. And so we're always going to rely on the most efficient sort of pattern matching. It's just what we do. That said, heuristics to me are a yes and a no. So to some extent, they are useful, because when there is a large body of work and or a lot of data points that when in aggregate, we can say with some confidence, putting the most important information on the screen right at this height in this placement on the screen is going to be like the largest chance that people will see it and engage with it. That to me is a good example of, sure, I can't guarantee that every single person's going to look at the same place on a screen when they open it up. Are they on the bus? Are they at home? Are they on a desktop? Those are fine. It's when you get into, to your point, thinking about averages and losing sight of the fact that when you get to aggregates and averages, you can no longer be thinking about the individual, and that makes it difficult, if not impossible, to also account for different context. So what I would say in answer to this, it's not as tidy as I wish it were for most people to probably would like the answer. It's that you've gotta ask yourself, where does context really matter? I'm over here, honestly, most of the time, I'm like, "It always matters," but realistically, you have to make decisions. So in your work, are there places where context being different won't radically change what you need to do? Those are places where heuristics and statistical averages and looking at things in aggregate, those are okay. But it's where you start to recognize that a change in context could actually really make a really big difference in whatever unfolds. Then you can no longer rely on that. And you really do have to find ways to explore that context, whether it's build the means to the phrase everyone loves is sense and respond. Build the means to sense and figure out in this context, if we do it this way, what will the outcome be? Is it desirable? Great. Let's keep doing it and amplify it. If it's not what we want, let's try something else. And really just shortening the loop or the timeline to sense or probe something and then get the response back. The faster you can do that, the faster and better you can sense, and the faster and more efficiently you can respond. That takes the place of relying on big tomes of best practices, heuristics, et cetera, et cetera. And I should also say, because I can always hear the chorus of voices in my head of folks who would listen to this and say, that's great, Jen, but I really just open up Figma and I spend my day wireframing. And actually, I don't think anybody really does that anymore. But ultimately, for those who are doing the equivalent of that in their role, that's great. That's fine. Not everybody needs to or wants to think about this in their work. Um, I know craft is weird. It's a weird word right now. It's a third rail in some ways, but I do think there's a role for specialty. Being a generalist versus a specialist is this other sort of trope. There's an important role for specialists and for folks who really do become experts in a particular technique or craft that also focuses on specific contexts. So if you're a designer who works on a very specific type of product and the context of use for that product is pretty consistent, and you're like, why are people like Jen out here overcomplicating things? Like, I get you. You can totally, well, you should probably listen to the end of the podcast just for that for the podcast, but you can forget everything I have to say. You don't have to worry about it. But for those of you who I know this is probably resonating, you're like, okay, wait, there's more here. That's the key is understanding the difference. Yeah. Right. Hmm. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. It's like, I don't like having a romantic partner because it's political. Like, I don't like being a human in the world and engaging with other humans because it's political. What it really means is that, like, people want their workplace sometimes people are looking for their workplace to be almost like a refuge from the aspects of life that are complex and unpredictable, and I think especially as the world does gestures vaguely at everything more and more, we all kind of find ourselves with less and less cognitive and emotional bandwidth to put into managing that. So if I already have to navigate complexity every day in my real life, which like that's my other big thing I'm always on about is don't let any consultant out there sell you complexity management as if it's some brand new thing. Like all humans are born knowing how to learn and knowing how to navigate complexity because it's like what we're made by evolutionary forces to be able to do. We just tend to, I often talk about kinking the hose. School, society, the ways that we like want to work in the world, we've kind of beaten that out of ourselves somewhat. And so for a lot of people, it's not something new as much as unkinking the hose in a way, maybe new language for it that allows you to use those skills that you kind of already have in some domains. But I'm sympathetic to the
Mhm.
the software engineers or the people in the various stereotypes who are like, look, I just want to put my head down and code all day. Okay, I don't want to deal with this. At the end of the day, yeah, there's always a complex component to their work. But when someone's looking for their work or their craft or what they're getting, their labor to be a refuge from that, I understand why it happens. And it will be, to be frank, that will be the difference between someone, in terms of their career progression.
Right.
And
Yeah.
if you accept that, it's all good. But if you really want to be able to earn more and more freedom or agency for yourself and see the impact of your work, then you're going to eventually have to face complexity head on. So
Yeah, absolutely. And that is exactly the point of this conversation today. And everybody listening out there, if you don't understand these things, you're going to be stuck, I think, at that mid-level.
yes.
That person, really great designer, they're amazing designer, but they can't navigate all the other stuff that will make them the super IC or eventually a
Yeah.
leader, manager, whatever. So I got sidetracked a second ago. I was going down this path. I was going to ask you about learning.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I believe very strongly, this idea you can't build great software without great relationships, but it's the insights and the key learnings
Yes.
that those relationships unlock. So I want to talk a little bit about that from your perspective. You got that talk, learning is the engine, really great talk. And we're going to put in the show notes, but everybody should definitely listen to that. But talk a little bit to me about the concept of learning and how learning can empower us to move forward
Yeah.
when we're dealing with complex systems.
Yeah. And right off the bat, I just have a hard time with the word learning. It's what I use because that's what it is to me. But I know right away you say learning and immediately there's a mental model for what that is. Most people will think of a
Like a
formal
class or
learning
something.
environment, the
Yeah.
classroom, or a training, a transactional information or skills kind of building process, or reinforcement learning, especially now related to machine learning and AI. And I would just say, just stop for a second when we talk about learning. Like I am truly talking about learning at a bit of a higher level, which is simply you take in something, you have an experience, you have an encounter, you seek something out, and then through some process, whatever it is, something changes. To me, learning is adaptation. So learning is simply the process of interacting with something, even if it's just yourself, that produces a change or produces an adaptation. And so to that end, you're talking about relationships. I hear that. And of course, my brain, like, yeah, we're singing the same song, especially because when you do start to think about the broader system in which whatever you're doing exists, you can't help but realize it isn't just about the pieces in the system, the nodes. In fact, for most complex systems folks out there, it's so much more meaningful to look at what is in between those things, the relationships between them, what flows between them, both tangible and intangible, like literal things like information or data or money, but also knowledge, power, et cetera, et cetera. And then on top of that, the understanding of the interactions that those things have with each other. So thinking about your relationships and the way that you engage with others, you are in a way making it more possible for the sort of invisible infrastructure of the system to become available to you, which makes learning that much more effective because you are able to have sort of almost like a distributed like web through which opportunities to see and understand something differently make themselves available. And there's also all kinds of really fascinating stuff about how learning isn't something that happens inside our brains anyway. It's social, it's situated, distributed cognition, like where does my brain and my environment, like where's one end and the other one start? So there's a lot of really interesting things you can unpack. And if folks dig into anything we're talking about today or I can send you a bunch of links. But that's, I think, a really important thing to consider, even if you don't care to get into like system science. If in your current role right now, there's room for a little bit more appreciation of the fact that the stuff in between the things, the relationships, the interactions, they aren't just, I got to do this. I got to remember to network a little bit. I got to make sure people know who I am. I got to be friendly. It isn't just that. If you want to get really kind of down about it, the real version of like value in those situations isn't just there's like a networking opportunity, but rather there's knowledge and learning that's waiting to happen. So you put yourself in a position to kind of be more effective of a learner and for not just individuals to learn, but for groups to learn, for systems to learn, for teams and organizations to learn as a whole by really tending to the relationships and not just the stuff.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, and this is something that's interesting. I feel like the older people tend to get, the wiser they get, and they start to realize I might not want to play politics, but maybe I have to if I want to influence this group or whatever.
Yeah.
And that's something the hallmark of sort of like the junior, I'm going to die on this hill over this color of this button versus going and playing ball with the rest of the
Yeah.
team. But one of the things that this sort of leads me to the next thing I want to talk about, which is this idea of working within formal and informal networks within our organizations and how those relationships and those learnings can help you navigate to ultimately, as designers, we talk a lot about like influence and seat at the table and all this stuff, but you can't really, I don't think, influence if you don't understand how those networks work, who influences, who officially is in charge, who is unofficially in charge. So I want to talk a little bit about that idea of informal and formal networks and ultimately how it applies to this larger idea of a complex system, specifically within the system that we work in versus the outside user experience. But
I think that I think I even said the phrase a little bit ago, there's an invisible infrastructure. And if any infrastructure, if it's healthy, if it's functional, if the roadways and highways and airport hubs and transportation infrastructure, of an area is healthy and well designed and well maintained, then like good things happen. And then when it's not, when it's derelict or it's not whatever maintained, you see what happens in like a region. So that metaphor as infrastructure, I think, is useful here because when you think about inside an organization, you have like formal, visible organizational structures, usually fairly hierarchical. Not always. Sometimes they're a little flatter. Hierarchy is not always bad either. We can come back to that. But when it becomes crystallized and like kind of power structures are like made permanent, that makes things tough. But you've got your formal structures that do play a role. And then everybody knows internally, even the people who are like, I don't play politics. Everybody knows here, this is the person that if I really need to ask a question that I can't ask out loud in a big meeting, I'll go ask them in Slack. Or everybody knows that like this group somehow just gets their shit done, even though they get kind of told not to, or they get told they have to work around things, like they somehow just find a way. Or there are like the good versions and the bad versions of these like informal networks. Everyone knows like the gossip networks or the weird secret clubs that create more problems. But I'm much more interested in, and I think where the complexity and systems kind of orientation becomes valuable is in just being aware of and thinking about the invisible networks. And you cannot engineer them. You cannot make them be good or make them happen. It's more about tending to something that might already exist or want to grow. Gardener metaphor alert, right? We have a lot of these in my world, but like, how do you become the sort of tender or gardener of these things that either exist or are trying to exist and give them a little bit of space and breathing room? So a lot of times people who are in management roles or executive roles are coached to look for signs of healthy informal relationships and try to let them breathe or support them, make sure people have opportunity and like safety to sort of meet in those ways that are outside of the formal structures. But even for people who are not in a management role, who are individual contributors, again, when you get to kind of mid-senior level, even if you aren't directly managing somebody in the formal structure, your role as a senior level person in the informal sense actually becomes more important because it's not like you have to rule without a title or lead without a title or whatever those kind of frames are. It's more like start looking and just paying attention and listening for where those dynamics are. They're not going to be on the org chart. They're going to be in the Slack channels, in the DMs. They're going to be in the olden days, you'd have a meeting and after the meeting, you walk out and like two of you would look at each other and then go to the bathroom at the same time, right? It's that stuff. And so even if you're not, a titled manager or leader, you as a more senior level person with experience and with perspective, you can start to notice that stuff. And when you notice that stuff, you can start to help it grow, help it accomplish things. This is where it ties back to learning because so much of being, and we keep saying learning, let me say quickly, I don't just mean you as an individual learning and getting better, but I mentioned earlier, learning as a team. The more effectively a team can take in new knowledge, sense what's changing, change what it's doing. Again, the sense and respond thing. How good can we build some shared sense making here? And how effectively and quickly can we respond? That's learning. So if you're in a senior role, your ability to help others around you learn individually, but also together becomes a superpower that not only is good for your career, but also helps the things you're trying to achieve actually happen more effectively. And none of that's happening in the formal org chart kind of structure. So long-winded way of saying, start paying attention to it and you can feel out where it is and then you can help it grow.
I love that. Yeah, because that's the other thing that I always love to stress with this idea of relationships. It's a two-way street.
Yes.
It's like I'm getting insights, but I'm also sharing them. And if I have relationships with those people, they learn what I learn. They understand what I understand. Or even like they hear something and it's, well, I understand it differently. Let's figure this out. And then so maybe we're both wrong and we both figured it out together. But that idea of relationships. The other thing I want to dig into next, and I love that you just segued it perfectly for me, was this idea of soil and seeds and sunlight and growing and all that stuff. And I'm thinking about complex systems within the group that we work, within the org that we work in, large complex systems. I like to use the metaphor or example rather of low design maturity. And something that I often say is individual contributors often think, I don't have a manager role. I'm not a leader. I can't influence how my team works. I'm stuck. I feel stuck in this low design maturity org. But this is a great example, I think, of how you as an individual contributor can directly influence, if not the CEO at the very top in the corner office, at least your core team, right? And thinking about this in terms of a complex org, being able to set the groundwork for that. I want to make a change. I don't like the way we work. We're low design maturity. You can't just come in and demand people change, because if the soil isn't right, if there is no sunlight or something from the top coming in and helping that seed grow, you'll never influence change and you'll probably just end up looking like a dummy. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I don't know, maybe we could use the example of low design maturity as an example to talk through this, but soil and seeds and sunlight and how we can influence from where we are. I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. And I think you've probably sensed, if someone is watching the video version of this, you watch me cringe even when I use this metaphor, because I think it's apt and I will continue to use it. But I am very keenly aware, especially those who are sort of plugged into systems and complexity and even futures and kind of related work, like the environmental, gardening, tending, rewilding, these metaphors abound. And so they're starting to become a little bit like overdone. So I'm a little bit like, nonetheless, that's not true everywhere. And that doesn't take away from the fact that they are still meaningful. So that said, I like this metaphor, especially for learning and for adaptive capacity. When people talk about design maturity, I don't know about you guys, but I just want to be like, what does that even mean? Right? Like, I know what it means. We all know what it means, like in our gut. But if your manager was like, okay, so-and-so, I'm going to give you the next 6 months and make your only responsibility to improve our design maturity in this team or in this org. Like, what the hell are you even going to do? A, and B, when they go, but I also want you to make a plan and tell me how you're going to measure it. Like, sure, there's plenty of like metrics. There's plenty of like sort of stand-in things that are proxies for or like indicators of how effective or mature a practice is. But at the end of the day, like, what are you really going to do? I hear design maturity, and it's kind of in the same bucket as things like psychological safety, where we get it backwards. We think we need to make it happen. We need to drive it. We need to engineer it. We need to, like an experience, put things in place and then the thing will happen. When in fact, these are emergent properties or traits of a system that emergence as an idea, which sounds poetic, but actually has a scientific meaning, which is basically that the parts of a system will engage in a way where a behavior will happen that would not be predicted by simply adding up the sum of the parts. People sometimes say it's greater than sum of parts, but emergence doesn't always mean greater than sum of parts. It just means different. You couldn't.
It's organic. It's not something someone says.
If you take it apart and analyze all the parts and then kind of put them all together and see what the whole is, this emergent thing might happen differently than that. So emergence in a social setting is interesting. And I would say that I think things like the concept of design maturity, psychological safety, other things that we think about as indicators of like goodness in our practices, these are emergent properties that come about from conditions that make them possible. So the big mindset shift, and then I'll come back to the soil stuff, is how do you quit worrying about make the thing, psychological safety or design maturity happen? And how do we arrange or nudge or wiggle or change or manage the conditions from which we make that more likely to emerge? And so a big part of like complexity informed practice, if you get into that world and start Googling, is going to be people repeating these kind of platitudes, but they're also true. It's no longer about driving things directly. It's more about changing the conditions, managing the substrate. Love that one if you know what a substrate is, but it's change the stuff, in this case,
more
soil,
gardening terms,
and try to make the situation such that you can both play with and change the substrate or the conditions And then also quickly see through monitoring or looking for weak signals, is it having a desirable effect or not? So that you can then quickly change what you're doing and try something else. I like talking about affordances here because designers know what affordances are generally. And so you can kind of think about it as conditions or substrate, or how am I affecting or nudging the affordances of the system or the environment in a way that makes design maturity more likely to emerge. So coming back to the metaphor, I like to think about soil, seeds, and sunlight and other kinds of like nutrients, because you kind of need all three for something to emerge or grow. And if I'm trying to grow a plant or grow a garden, there are definitely things I can control directly, but then there are things I really can only kind of control indirectly by making things like better and more amenable to them. And then there are also things I have no control over whatsoever, and not even often an indicator of what's going to happen, like weather, but I've still got to be kind of prepared for, or like in some way I have readiness for the unpredictability of it. So with learning, I often talk about these and I say, you need to first think about making the soil a healthy place that will be receptive to a change, a disruption, an anomaly, because that's where learning is going to happen. And if the soil doesn't even accept a seed, if the soil is not fertile, if the soil will just swallow it up, if the soil is actually rock and things bounce off of it. So metaphors abound, but one, in your role, in your team, in your environment, what is the soil like? Is there something you can do to make it more friendly or fertile? And that can be simply things like I talked about earlier, looking for ways to make it safe for people to interact in an informal way, trying to build a little bit more slack into the system that allows some things to emerge and not have everything be driving on a timeline every minute of the day. That's tough when you don't set the schedule or the roadmap, but even within it, you can push outwards a little bit, metaphorically sometimes, use your seniority to earn the right to do that a little bit. So that's like soil. Then I talk about seed, and seed is what I alluded to as disruptions, or, that's funny, or this thing happened that no one expected, or it doesn't always have to be a bad disruptive thing. It can also be oh, I just got really curious about this, or I had a spark of interest or inspiration about this. Whatever the thing is, there are people who talk about disorienting dilemmas. There's another phrase called problem posing education. There's so many cool, this is where the aphoretic kind of phase in the Cynefin framework comes in. There's so many cool like ways of talking about this that probably gonna write a book about it, but there's something that happens, an encounter, an interface, moment. And those are kind of the seeds in this metaphor. You can kind of manufacture it sometimes, but a lot of seeds fall from trees at random. And so it's so important to have the soil ready, because maybe you can manufacture the seeds, maybe you can't. The more ready you are, the better you'll be off. And then the last part of that metaphor being, how do you create spaces where you can continue to nurture whatever starts to grow? You can't always control or even predict things like the weather, will it rain enough, et cetera. But if you know that you're in an environment where, again, metaphor, this process is going to need a lot of like fertilizer and water to go anywhere. Like, how do you arrange things to be able to get that into place, versus if this is something that can survive in a desert, then I'm not worried about making sure this thing gets enough water. Those are really weird and abstract, but bring it back to design maturity. What kind of things could we change within our direct control, even if they're very small, very minor, how we work together, how we meet, how we collaborate, try one thing differently here. Maybe when we get into the actual process of doing work or reviewing or talking to each other, changing something in a way that makes it a little bit more safe for what you think design maturity looks like might emerge. And then as that happens, what are you noticing? What are you not noticing? What can you tend to and not? And so a lot of it, people end up down, I think, a well-intentioned but problematic path where they go, what would it look like? That's our North Star vision. Now let's backwards engineer the ways to get there. And that isn't really how any kind of complex human system works, because the minute something shifts, that North Star vision is really not always relevant, because the path has changed under your feet, that metaphor about the roadmap now. And so being much more comfortable at adjacent possibles, try a thing, move to the next spot you've learned something. Now take a new look at your surroundings and what you've learned. What can you try next? Moving from adjacent possible to adjacent possible, and you might get to that North Star vision, or you might actually end up discovering something better or different that you prefer.
Yeah, I love that. So much unpacked there. But something I was thinking about in my head as you were talking about planting the seeds. We've got all these seeds. How many seeds fall from a tree that never grow?
Yeah.
They just get eaten by bugs, get eaten by animals or something, and they end up somewhere else. Or keeping this metaphor alive, you think they're going to die. They get eaten by a bird or something, and they get crapped out like hundreds of miles away, and then they become a tree. And this is an interesting thing, because what I love about this, though, is that just like you said, that having that North Star, I think it's good to have an idea of where you want to go so that if,
Yes.
you're further away from it than where you wanted to be. But at the same time, being so flexible, because like that example of a bird eating the thing and crabbing it out 100 miles away. What if that's actually what you wanted, but
Yeah.
you had never thought about it? It's like keeping your mind open again to this learning so that you can change, you can be flexible. And I think in these large, complex orgs, designers tend to get very frustrated when things don't happen exactly the way they want. We don't follow that
Yeah.
process exactly. And that's when they start to get really upset about things like design
Yeah.
maturity. But finding just like being open to just
Yeah.
what's good here.
Yeah.
Like something's positive. What's the positive
Yeah.
in this instead of being so negative all the time? Anyway, that was something I was thinking about. But then also too, something I think about design maturity, this is something I like to say. I think you can influence your direct team to improve a process for the better, but sometimes you can't. And I think thinking about that metaphor with soil, seeds, and sun, I'm going to plant this seed. What does it need? Is it possible? Is it even worth my time to try?
Yeah.
And if not, do I belong here? Is this the right company for me?
Yeah.
And that sort of helps to impact
Yes.
all kinds of things about mental health. The other thing I'm also thinking about is just as it relates to mental health, beating your head against the wall over and over again, being upset that something isn't the way you wanted. At the end of the day, this is a job and we're getting paid and it's transactional and you give me a paycheck. Like, why would I like beat myself up over this at the end of it if I'm still getting paid, right?
I know.
So anyway, I just think about all these things kind of were flooding into my head as you were talking about this metaphor.
Can I interrupt you really
but
fast because I want to be like
good.
perfect extension of the metaphor it's a great illustration of that concept of, I think I want this. I think I want a seed to be planted and I want it to grow. I don't even have the courage to imagine that tree growing 100 miles away. And yet, if I'm open enough to emergence or whatever, and I make the conditions right for it, and some little animal takes it and poops it out somewhere, then I've got even better than what I imagined. I think that's a really good extension of the metaphor to show exactly what I'm talking about. But with that comes kind of what you're getting to is this sense of, okay, so guys, be more open, be more patient, be more flexible, accept uncertainty. And I start to hear this kind of, I don't know, call out in the world, which is you need to work on yourself. You need to do the inner work. There's a lot of interest in inner development goals and inner work. And some of it I'm all for. Anything that makes you a little bit more reflective, makes you kind of able to think and be adaptable and reflective in what you do. Fine, wonderful. But there's a lot of like, how do I increase people's uncertainty tolerance? How do I do this? How do I make the people on my team do that? How do I convince this person to be more open-minded? We've all run into that frustration. And I think it's important to note for the listeners and the viewers that like there is to some extent the ability for some of that to happen, especially if you yourself start to embrace and embody and model this way of thinking and working. Much like language immersion, just as people are around you, they can kind of find some comfort and some confidence in what otherwise used to feel kind of scary, to be a little bit open to a lot of these things happening differently than expected. But it's not a guarantee. And at the end of the day, like I will always encounter people who want nothing to do with this way of thinking or working. And I hope for their sake, life experiences bring them to a place where they can be a little bit more open. But, how much of that is an immutable personality trait? How much of that is something that can be fixed or changed or whatever? And then how condescending and absurd is it for me to think that like I or anyone else can fix someone or help them become more open-minded? So you weren't suggesting that, but it kind of reminded me of that path that I think sometimes this takes. So beware, friends, the person who will kind of swing in and say, well, if you just work on yourself, you can become a little bit more open and higher level of consciousness, and all of this will be tolerable. Because I have so much empathy and compassion for the folks who are like, I can't do any of this. My environment I work in is toxic. Everybody works from a place of fear all the time. Nobody's going to stick their neck out. I can't do anything you're talking about, even if I want to, because I have to keep my job, because I have to pay my mortgage and feed my kids. To your point, you might be working in a desert where no seed will plant. And so what you can do at that point is think about harm reduction and say, okay, nothing might grow in this desert, but what can I do while I'm here in the desert that is meaningful to me, that gets me ready for some future thing that might look different?
Yeah. I mean, like, this is sort of my thought here too, and not everybody can do this, but find joy where you can find joy.
Yeah.
If I can't, like, is writing, drawing, just playing with Legos, hanging out with my kids, and getting off work at 5 o'clock to take them somewhere, get ice cream. Like, it's just a job. And I feel like this is totally off topic, but so many designers, we like, identify with our
It's
title
really
and it's
key.
us and it is
Really
like
key.
our thing. But do plumbers do that? Do electricians do that? Do garbage men do that? I mean, it's just a job at the end of the
You're
day,
really
but we
right.
take it so seriously. I don't know.
The identity piece of it is something that comes up in conversations a lot for me, like other podcasts or interviews or things lately. It seems like it sort of comes back. And I think a lot of that's because of the existential crisis that design is having right now. And there's a lot of thrashing and wailing in attempt to like define design or to argue for it. It's wild for me to even look at right now some of the stuff about X being combined or whatever and compared to 10 years ago. Like what a wild journey it's been. But ultimately, anybody who I watch kind of trying to like in their hands about like, gosh, people don't just they just don't understand. I should be doing what the product people are doing, and or you guys don't understand. X design isn't UI. You are wasting your energy because you as an individual can never define how people see you as a human. You can never define how people see your craft or your profession. You're better off learning how to let go of the identity and just do the thing you want to be doing. Find ways to do the thing you're doing. I like joked earlier, I don't know what I call myself in my work. I mean, I'm a designer in my heart, but I'm a strategist, I'm a consultant. The work I do is really more systems and organizational, but at the end of the day, it shows up in the tangible parts of like UX or systems or experience design. I don't worry about that. And people can rightly criticize that I've had the luxury or the privilege to not have to worry about it, but I've been able to carve out spaces where I'm not so worried about the identity of being a designer. It doesn't make me feel uncomfortable if someone maybe this is a bad comparison, but to be, say, like, misgendered and, like, avoiding, like, the bigger question of everyone should be able to use their pronouns everywhere, that kind of thing, but I'm she, her, and if I walk down the street and someone misgenders me just because they misgender me, like, it's okay in the sense that they got it wrong, but I don't feel like my career is as fraught in that same way that, like, gender would be. So, maybe I've opened up a terrible can of worms and we should just edit this out, alright? But there's some interesting parallels for me, the way that people do cling to their identity as a designer that to me just doesn't serve you the way that it would be important to make sure people understand, "These are my pronouns, respect me as a human." Like, we almost treat them with the same level of weight, and, like, to your point, I'm right there in the camp being like, "Yo, if you're getting paid by somebody else to build wealth for someone else, you're not solving you're not solving you're not a surgeon curing brain cancers and such. You're not doing that every day, and you're literally just helping someone else get a little bit richer. Put it in perspective once in a while. That's all.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
encourage
Yeah.
it.
And take a
Take a
vacation day.
vacation.
That's what I say.
Model it for the other people so they know it's safe too. Everybody I work with
That's
has
it.
the
Yeah.
ability to
Yeah.
take their vacation. Solidarity. Also form a union, but
I love that. Tech Workers Unite. I love it. All right. So we've had you for a long time. This has been an amazing conversation, by the way. I've just sort of scratched the
well,
surface. There's so much here that we could have dug into, and I'm super happy we got a chance to chat about it. Before we get out of here, just one last thing. Anybody listening today, take away one thing about complexity and learning and all that stuff. What do you hope that one thing is?
I think mainly it would be consider that no matter what you do, where you work, where your design practice or other design adjacent work shows up, you never, ever have a full picture. And knowing that can kind of radically change how you approach what you're doing to make what you're trying to achieve more effective. It doesn't mean for everybody that you have to zoom out and get that 360 systems view. A lot of people like to do that, but then they get to that view and feel like they're God and they can't do anything else because they can't change something from that far above. You still have to zoom back in and do the work. So you don't have to see the system to just appreciate that you are part of a complex adaptive system. And even just, I think, acknowledging that at the surface can go a long way. And then if that's interesting, go look into it. You dive in. There's all kinds of interesting stuff out there. And like I said earlier, I'll share a bunch of resources and stuff so people can dig in.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, please do. And we will add it all to the show notes. But yeah, this has been amazing. All right, Jen. So before we get out of here, I have got a few questions I like to ask all of my guests to help our listeners get to know our guests a little bit better. You have a few minutes to stick around and answer some silly little questions. All right, great. First thing that comes to your mind, now this is not very hard by any means, but what is your favorite non-design book?
Oh God, I wish I had like actually prepared answers to these. My answers are always so bad because I don't know. I like everything. I love all my children. Blah blah. I will say this. I tend to read a ton of nonfiction, but my favorite books are a handful of fiction novels. So right now, I would say I am a big fan of Cormac McCarthy. And of course, Blood Meridian is like kind of the one above all. But his most recent novels, The Passenger and Stella Maris, they are, you're like, well, okay, great. They are incredibly, in my opinion, relevant to anybody who's interested in complexity science, as well as people who think about experience and language. And I guess my note on all of that would just be, I hope everybody's favorite book isn't a design book. Like, I try to read as much non-design related crap as I can to be able to make all those connections. So yeah, that's my answer, is that or The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. I'm a nerd.
Oh,
So
nice.
I like
Yeah,
things.
I love it. Yeah, I this summer I made a point to not read any design books at
Good,
all. And I picked just like really cheesy like pop novels
good.
and stuff. Hail Mary, what's his name? The guy, the Martian author, Andy something.
Yeah,
Anyway, but stuff like that. Just
yeah,
like
good.
non-design, just take me
You
away
need that.
for a little while. And yeah, I think everybody does. I think you're right. If your favorite book is a nonfiction book about
I like
design,
that you ask about books because I also I read a lot. I'm a reader. Yeah, I know not everyone is. Not everyone likes to read. Not everyone like engages effectively with the printed word, and I know not everyone has time. But I have so many books and things that are written that I want to share with people all the time. Like my love language is giving people links to things and books and resources, and a lot of times, thanks, Jen. And I know they'll never get to it, so I feel bad because I wish I could provide non-book versions of things. So
I
yeah,
love that.
yeah,
Yeah, I wish I had more time to read.
we'll
I
do.
don't know if you have kids. I got two kids,
Yeah,
and my kids are just like
we all do.
just they're yeah. I was like, by the time they go to bed, I'm like, I'm
Yeah,
done. I want to go
yeah.
sleep. All right, next up, what is your favorite non-design
So
podcast?
here's the flip side of that, which is I don't really listen to any one podcast like regularly. And this is where I just feel like an outsider to the rest of the world. I will say, so just rather than giving like a specific podcast, I approach podcasts in sort of the same way, in that if somebody or something says, "Hey, you should listen to this," or whatever, I put it in my queue. But I haven't really built a place in my life where podcasts kind of fit. Like I used to read on my commute. Now I don't commute, and I don't listen. I listen to music in the car. I listen to music when I clean. So like I'm the weirdos. I don't know. None.
That's all right. Yeah.
But again, I feel like there are so many interesting one-off episodes, and that's been my engagement with podcasts. So if anybody's out there's kind of like me, I'd love to hear from you guys, because the ones who are like, I religiously listen to this every episode. But if you're one of the people that's, I just listened to this, or someone shared me with this, or I saw this episode, or I ended up down the YouTube rabbit hole or whatever, I have found that to be a very effective way of engaging with podcasts. So.
Yeah. So it's funny because the podcasts I tend to listen to are like history podcasts.
Mhm.
I like a lot of history
Yeah.
podcasts, and they're linear. There's a
Yeah.
you got to listen to them in order, like history of Rome, history of
Yeah.
Byzantium, history of
Yeah.
England, or the history of English podcast,
Yeah.
which is really interesting about the English
Yeah.
language. That one's really interesting. Anyway, but those are all, and you can't just skip
Yeah,
ahead.
that's fair.
But
I mean, those are the ones that
you
I've
know,
really engaged in multi-episode, because that's same. I like a lot of documentary style stuff. Honestly, the one that's coming to mind right now, which I guess I should give the answer, is there's a really good multi-part series about the construction of the Big Dig in Boston,
oh
which is
wow, okay,
like the
yeah,
biggest
yeah,
engineering project like in modern history, and also a total shit show. So if you're from here, if you're from Boston or have like history tied up with the Big Dig and the way that it disrupted everyone's life for 30 years, you'd appreciate it. It's really well done. And even for folks who have no connection to it whatsoever, it's a good example of what I think is a good listener experience, the way that they've crafted the narrative across the go back in time, zoom out chronologically, but zoom back in to make things meaningful. So
yeah. And I would imagine, thinking about the idea of complexity, there's probably it was a very complex project with a lot of things that could have gone wrong and influenced other things
absolutely.
with it. Yeah.
Yep.
All right. Interesting. All right. Next up, what is your favorite meal? This could be something you've cooked or had at a restaurant, or something your grandma used to cook. Favorite
Probably
meal.
like an old family recipe for ravioli from scratch. My grandma made it. My dad used to make it as a kid. I'm actually vegan and have been for like 20 something years, but I remember first kind of figuring out how to make a vegan version of it was a really meaningful and special thing for me. So I don't have it very often, because making the dough and making the filling and rolling it all out takes forever. And it's a super labor of love, but that's my answer. I like a good dumpling-shaped food in almost any cuisine. So momos from Himalayan food, dumplings, wonton. So give me a dumpling, a pierogi. Yeah.
I love it. Yeah, I love a good pierogies are good. Ravioli. I love all the like dumplings.
Mhm.
Little dumplings, so good. All right. Next up, what is your favorite vacation spot?
Yeah, this is like the podcast episode. Like, I just like different things. We don't go anywhere,
wherever
any
you
one
go, yeah.
place. I will say this. I've kind of become a person that in adulthood, rather than approaching things like time away or vacations as like a big chunk, it ends up being something that gets spread out and distributed throughout what I do. And there's probably a good metaphor for that in a lot of other parts of what we talked about distributed decision-making, distributed leadership, and distributed cognition. But in the summer, because we live about an hour from the beach, we'll go to the beach almost every weekend if the weather cooperates. In the winter, we snowboard almost every weekend. And those don't count as vacations to me, but they count as my vacation spots. I've just taken, a 1 or 2 week vacation and spread it out over the year. We do still travel. The times I've had to travel or gotten to travel for conferences to various Nordic and Scandinavian cities have been my favorite. So.
Yeah, I haven't had I've never been up there, but it's on my list.
God, Copenhagen.
Yeah.
Shout out if anybody's listening from Copenhagen, like Denmark. You guys, I walked around Copenhagen just feeling like I was surrounded by models and like I was not going to be allowed to be in the city much longer because I'm not anywhere near fashionably dressed enough or attractive enough to it was terrible.
Yeah, that's funny. I've never been, but I'm trying to get more UX talks and stuff. So we'll see.
That's what I've done. I've been applying to conferences that are in cities I want to go through. So that's how I ended up in Copenhagen and Helsinki.
Yeah, UX Copenhagen.
And I was in Iceland at one point, all for various talks or things. So highly recommend those of you listening who are looking for other recommendations for your career.
Let someone else pay for your vacations. I love that. All right, last question. What is your favorite design tool that is not Figma?
I don't even use Figma, which is glorious to say. I used to, but gosh, my favorite design tool is a conversation. Like, I
love that. No one's ever said that. You were the first.
I don't want to be one of those like weirdos who has to give like an atypical response, but I really think you made the point earlier about relationships, but I also think
I was just thinking
the dialectic of an interaction between you and anybody, anything. I guess maybe conversation doesn't even have to be with a human, like in the literary sense, man to self, man to his environment. Like, I think the interface when you bump into something, have a conversation with a person, is already shaping whatever is going to come in that second or third order way. So I think design starts far earlier than me sitting down to do a thing or shape a thing.
I love that. I don't know why I had never 133 episodes in, I had never considered conversation as a design tool, but you're absolutely right. I mean, co-design sessions, having a conversation, figuring it out, understanding the problem, that's all part of design.
Yeah.
Why is that not a design tool?
I thought of it, and here's why. The word tool made me think of language. And I joke a lot in conversations with people that I won't get into the details here, but there's a lot about language that is powerful and useful and amazing and has been the success of our species. But there's a lot about language that is dangerous and that constrains. If you look at it as a container that you use to put meaning in to hand it to somebody else, it means your meaning is constrained to the size and shape of the container. I just think of language as a tool, as a very rich and generative concept. And so as a design tool, that looks like conversation or interaction. And I just think there's a lot to unpack there that's kind of neat. So
that is very deep. I love it. No, that's a great answer. Very good. I might start using that myself. I'll give you credit. I'll give you full credit. All right, Jen. So this has, again, been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for coming on. Before we get out of here, let everybody know where they can find you, your YouTube channel, all that stuff. Give yourself a plug. Let everybody know where they can learn more about complexity and all that stuff.
Find me on LinkedIn. I also write on, not all the time, but on Medium. So find me on LinkedIn if you want to chat about any of this stuff. I'm always happy to hang out and chat with folks very casually about this stuff. And if you're interested, like I said, we can share some links, but if the stuff about complexity and learning is especially interesting, you want to dive in more, probably the best place is to find me on Medium. It's like Jen Briselli or whatever. And there's a lot of good resources there that I link out to in different places. So those are probably the two. You can find me via email. It's jen@topologyinsight.com, or my website for my little agency is topologyinsight.com. But find me on LinkedIn, the dumbest social network on the planet.
It really is. I will know that I have made it as a human when I don't need to go on LinkedIn anymore to post crap so I can make money.
A wonderful study in human behavior. Honestly, it's such a microcosm.
That's so weird.
You learn a lot.
Oh, freaking LinkedIn. All right. Jen, thank you so much for coming on. Again, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
My pleasure. This was super fun.